Sophie Richardson had never belonged in a world like this. The vast lobby of the Grand Hotel was a place where power and wealth collided, where the air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and freshly printed business deals. The marble floors beneath her feet gleamed with the polish of decades of money and influence that had passed through these halls. But Sophie was just a small part of this grand machine, another cog in the system, working tirelessly to make sure. The world of luxury kept turning. She had spent her entire life in the shadows of the elite, watching from a distance, longing for a life far beyond the one she had been dealt. She had always wanted more, but never knew if she'd truly have the chance to break free from her ordinary life. At 25, Sophie found herself working as a personal assistant in one of the most prestigious hotels in Los Angeles, a position she had fought tooth and nail to secure. The job was far from glamorous, and often it felt more like being invisible than truly participating in the world around her. But Sophie wasn't one to complain. She had made a promise to herself that she would make the most of the opportunities given to her, no matter how small they seemed. And then there was him, Alexander Sterling. Alex to those few who knew him personally. To Sophie, he was nothing short of a legend, a name that echoed through every corner of the tech world. He was the billionaire CEO who had built an empire from the ground up, a man whose every move was calculated, measured, and deliberate. Cold, untouchable. Every time Sophie crossed paths with him at the hotel, her breath caught in her chest and her pulse quickened in a way she couldn't explain. She was the assistant. He was the powerful businessman. They lived in different worlds, and she knew her place. Tonight, however, would be different. The hotel was buzzing with the energy of the annual Tech Summit, a glitzy event that brought together some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. The ballroom was filled with finely dressed executives, entrepreneurs, and investors, all gathered to celebrate and secure their latest deals. It was the sort of event Sophie had dreamed of attending but had never imagined would be a part of. Her life. And yet here she was moving through the crowd like a ghost, ensuring every detail was taken care of. From arranging the guest transportation to making sure the catering was on point, Sophie had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make the night a success. But her thoughts always returned to Alex. Even from across the room, Sophie couldn't help but notice him. He was effortlessly charismatic, standing tall in a perfectly tailored black suit, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that made him look even more striking. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, never missing a beat. There was something magnetic about him, something that Sophie couldn't ignore, even though she tried. He didn't just command the room with his presence. He owned it. As the night wore on, Sophie found herself more and more absorbed by the energy of the event. The clinking of glasses, the laughter of the guests, and the soft hum of conversations all felt like a distant background to the thoughts racing through her mind. She was supposed to be working, yet her focus kept drifting back to Alex. The way he moved through the crowd with ease, the way people deferred to him, the way he seemed to hold the world in his hands. It was also foreign to her. And yet, it was everything she had ever wanted. Somehow, Sophie lost track of time. The wine flowed freely as the evening progressed, and she, along with the other hotel staff, became increasingly caught up in the spirit of the event. Sophie, despite her better judgment, had allowed herself to indulge in a glass, or maybe a few too many of wine. She was, after all, just an assistant. Who would notice if she had a little fun for once? But by the time the dinner began, Sophie could feel the wine taking hold of her. She was dizzy, disoriented, and yet there was a strange freedom in it. The tension she had carried with her for so long began to melt away. She smiled more, laughed more, and for the first time she allowed herself to just be, at least for the evening. And then came the moment she would later wish she could erase. After the dinner, Alex, who had been holding court throughout the event, seemed to be in a more relaxed mood. His usual stiff composure had loosened, and he had even started cracking jokes. Sophie, still feeling the effects of the wine, didn't hesitate to join in on the playful banter. He had always seemed like someone who was so unreachable, but tonight, for some reason, he was different. He was laughing, joking, engaging with her in a way she hadn't expected. Their conversation took on a life of its own, a back and forth. That felt easy, natural even. She had never seen him like this. Then, as the evening drew to a close, Alex leaned in, his words warm but teasing. "You're drunk," he said with a smirk, pointing a fork in her direction. Sophie giggled, her head a little foggy. "And you're drunk too, Mr. Sterling." He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "I'm heading to my room," he said, standing up with a slight sway. "Try not to get lost." Sophie, still caught up in the buzz of the evening, didn't quite register the seriousness in his tone. She waved him off and sat back in her chair, trying to steady herself, but the room seemed to tilt around her. She could hardly walk straight as she stood up to leave. All she needed to do was get to her room, kick off her shoes, and fall into bed. It would be simple. But of course, nothing was ever that simple. As she stumbled down the hallway, her vision blurred by the wine, the door numbers on the hotel's plush carpeted hallways seemed to dance before her eyes. She squinted at them in frustration. What kind of font was this, she mumbled to herself, muttering curses at the numbers that refused to make sense. Then, in a stroke of luck or perhaps fate, she noticed a door slightly ajar. The soft light spilling from the crack seemed to beckon her. It was the perfect opportunity. She was too exhausted to care, too drunk to think straight. Without a second thought, she kicked off her heels, dropped her bag haphazardly on the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. It was the softest bed she'd ever felt, the sheets cool and inviting against her skin. For the first time that night, she felt like she could finally let go. She closed her eyes and let the world slip away. What Sophie didn't know was that she wasn't alone. The room she had stumbled into was not hers. It was Alex's. When Alex returned to his room that night, the last thing he expected was to find Sophie asleep in his bed. He had never been one for surprises, always controlling every aspect of his life, from his business decisions to his personal boundaries. But this was completely unexpected. His mind was still fuzzy from the wine, but even in his hazy state, he could tell something was off. His first thought was that he was dreaming. His second was that his pillow was breathing. And his third was the realization that his pillow had hair. Sophie's long brown locks were spread out across his pillow, and her soft breathing filled the otherwise silent room. He froze for a moment, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Sophie was lying there, completely unaware, as if she belonged. This was the start of something neither Sophie nor Alex had ever anticipated. Neither of them knew what was about to happen next, but fate had already set its course. As the night unfolded, it would reveal a truth neither could ignore, and Sophie, still blissfully unaware, would soon find herself trapped in a web of emotions and consequences that would change everything. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. As she slowly opened her eyes, the light creeping in from the edges of the curtains, cutting through the fog in her mind. The room was unfamiliar, far too luxurious, and yet there was something about the softness of the sheets that felt strangely comforting. For a brief, hazy moment, she thought she was still dreaming. But then, as the haze lifted, everything came, rushing back. The wine, the laughter, the lightness of the night, and the overwhelming confusion that followed. She shot up in bed, panic settling in her chest like a weight. The bed she was lying in was not hers. The realization hit her hard, and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't in her room. She wasn't even in a guest room. The elegant decor surrounding her, fine silk curtains, the delicate scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air could only belong to one person. Alexander Sterling, her boss. She was in his room. The blood drained from Sophie's face as she scrambled out of bed, her hands trembling. Her mind raced through the events of the previous evening, trying to piece together what had happened. She remembered the dinner, the endless toasts, the carefree chatter, and then nothing. The moment the wine had taken over, everything had become a blur. She had made a mistake that could cost her everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a rustle of sheets. She froze. There, lying next to her, was Alex, his dark tousled hair spread out on the pillow. He was still, asleep, oblivious to the mess that had unfolded while he was passed out. Sophie's eyes widened. She had no idea what to do. Should she wake him up? Should she just leave before he even noticed her? But as her gaze lingered on him, a sense of absurdity crept over her. This was Alex, the man she had worked with for months, the man whose every move she had admired from afar. And now, here she was, lying in his bed. Alex stirred slightly, groaning as he shifted in his sleep, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room, trying to orient herself, searching for a way out of the madness she had stumbled into. But everything seemed surreal. She was trapped in a situation she couldn't undo, surrounded by the evidence of a night she could barely remember. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as she struggled to breathe. Then Alex's voice broke through the silence. "What the hell?" Sophie's heart stopped. She turned to face him, her face burning with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain this? How could she make sense of something that didn't make any sense? Alex blinked, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers, still bleary from sleep. The confusion in his gaze was evident, but there was something else there, too. Something Sophie couldn't quite place. Was it amusement? Annoyance? The uncertainty in his eyes made her stomach twist. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Sophie could feel the tension thickening in the room, the awkwardness hanging between them like an invisible weight. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, a moment that Sophie hadn't planned on, a moment that would forever alter the course of their relationship. She started, but her voice faltered. She cleared her throat and tried again, but her words seemed to echo back at her, hollow and pointless. I didn't mean to. I was drunk and I thought I was in my room, but... Alex's eyes softened, just the slightest bit. He sat up in bed, rubbing his temples as he tried to process what was happening. I know, he said quietly, his voice laced with a mix of exasperation and something else. Sophie couldn't tell if it was anger or amusement, but either way, it didn't make her feel any better. She wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said again, her voice more controlled this time. I swear I didn't. Alex gave a long sigh, his expression shifting to something unreadable. He paused, looking at her for what seemed like an eternity, his gaze studying her in a way that made Sophie feel both exposed and oddly safe. But that didn't make sense. He was her boss and she was an employee. There was no room for safety or vulnerability in this situation. It's fine, Alex finally said, his voice surprisingly calm. Don't worry about it. But Sophie couldn't stop worrying. She couldn't stop the panic that was clawing at her insides. She had crossed a line. She didn't know how it had happened, but she was suddenly entangled in something that wasn't just a simple mistake. This was a mistake that could ruin her career, and maybe even more. How could she go back to normal after this? How could she look Alex in the eye again without feeling like she had destroyed everything? I'm so sorry, Sophie whispered, feeling her cheeks flush with shame. She wanted to say more, wanted to explain herself, but her words were useless. Nothing she said could undo what had already been done. Alex stood up, his tall frame filling the room as he began to move toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. Sophie watched him, her heart still racing. Was he angry? Did he hate her now? Would he fire her on the spot? But instead of leaving the room, Alex turned around and met her gaze again. For the briefest moment, Sophie could have sworn she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that wasn't anger, but rather a curiosity that unsettled her more than anything else. This stays between us, all right? Alex said, his tone not harsh but firm. Sophie's breath caught in her throat and she nodded quickly. Of course, I won't tell anyone. Alex studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once as if making a decision. Good. Because if anyone finds out, it'll be a problem. His words hung in the air like a warning, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she had just narrowly escaped a catastrophe. She didn't know what Alex meant by a problem, but she didn't want to find out. She just wanted to get out of there, to put the night behind her and forget everything that had happened. I'll go, Sophie said quickly, standing up from the bed. She grabbed her bag from the floor and hurried toward the door, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Was he upset with her? Did he see her differently now? And most importantly, could she go back to being just his assistant after everything that had happened? But as she stepped out into the hallway, her thoughts were interrupted by Alex's voice calling after her. Sophie. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned around to face him, her stomach twisting in knots. Relax, he said, his voice calmer than before, though there was still a hint of something in his tone that Sophie couldn't quite place. It's not the end of the world, but it felt like it was. Sophie nodded, her eyes on the floor as she tried to steady her breathing. Right. Thank you, Alex. I'll just go back to my room. As she walked away, her mind raced. This wasn't over. She could feel it deep inside her. The tension between them hadn't just dissipated. It had only begun. And Sophie had a feeling that the consequences of last night's mistake were far from finished. In the quiet of her room, Sophie collapsed onto the bed, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic frenzy. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the situation finally began to sink in. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about something far bigger than she was ready to face. The events of the night had changed everything. She wasn't sure if it was for better or worse, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never look at Alex the same way again, and neither would he. The lines between professional and personal had blurred, and there was no going back. The days following the incident in Alex's hotel room felt like a strange blur to Sophie, like she was moving through a dream that she couldn't wake up from. The weight of what had happened hung over her, but the strangest part was that Alex seemed to have already moved past it, as though it hadn't been a big deal at all. He had promised it would stay between them, and for the most part he kept his distance, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship had shifted somehow. The professional boundaries they had shared for months had been crossed, even if only in the most subtle of ways. Sophie found herself haunted by the moments after she had left his room, when she had walked down the hallway, unsure of how to feel. A part of her wanted to pretend that nothing had happened, to go back to being just his assistant, but that seemed impossible now. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, the way his eyes had softened ever so slightly when he looked at her, as if he had seen something in her that he hadn't before. It was as though in that one moment, Alex had started to see her not as just an employee, but as something more, something he couldn't quite define. It wasn't until a few days later, when she was sitting at her desk trying to focus on the endless stream of emails that she received daily, that Alex approached her with a proposal. He had been unusually distant since the incident, and Sophie wasn't sure how to act around him anymore. But when he stood at her door looking like he always did, perfectly composed, the epitome of confidence, she couldn't help but feel a surge of nerves rush through her. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, but with an undertone that made her stomach twist. "I need to talk to you." Her heart skipped a beat and she stood quickly, suddenly aware of the fact that she had been staring at her computer screen for far too long. She tried to keep her tone neutral, though she was dying to know what he wanted. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. What's the matter?" Alex stepped into her office and closed the door behind him, a movement that made Sophie's pulse race. Why was he closing the door? Was he angry? Her thoughts were spiraling, and she was afraid of what was coming next. She had done her best to avoid him, to act as though everything was normal, but it wasn't normal. Not anymore. "Have a seat," Alex said, motioning to the chair opposite his. Sophie hesitated, then sat down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was trying to remain calm, but her heart was hammering in her chest and she could feel the tension building between them. Alex didn't immediately speak. Instead, he sat across from her, his dark eyes scanning her face in a way that made Sophie feel exposed. It was almost as if he was searching for something, trying to figure her out. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words, until, finally, he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "I need you to help me with something," he said. Sophie's mind raced. What could he possibly need her help with? Was this about the incident? Had he finally decided to address it? But instead of anger or frustration, there was only a quiet seriousness in his tone. "I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend," Alex said, his words hanging in the air between them. Sophie blinked, stunned. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for a moment, and she couldn't quite process what she had just heard. Was he serious? Pretend to be his girlfriend? It was the last thing she had ever expected him to ask her. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to keep it steady. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Alex leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him as he explained. "We're in the middle of a major negotiation with a group of investors. They're interested in the stability of our company, but they're also interested in the personal lives of those involved. They want to see a connection between me and my team. They want to see trust. They want to see that I'm someone they can rely on. And honestly, Sophie, they don't believe I'm human unless they see me with someone." Sophie could feel her pulse quickening as she tried to digest what Alex was saying. This wasn't just some odd request, it was strategic. He needed her help not because of who she was as a person, but because of her ability to play a role. She wasn't sure how she felt about being reduced to just an accessory in his world. It made her stomach churn, but she couldn't deny the practicality of it. "But why me?" she asked, the words coming out more quietly than she intended. "There must be someone else. Someone better suited for this kind of thing." Alex's gaze softened for the briefest moment, but there was no hesitation in his words. "You're the one I trust. You're the one who's been by my side through all of this, and you know the ins and outs of what's at stake here. Besides, he added with a wry smile, you're the best at keeping everything together. You'll know how to make this convincing. Sophie stared at him, still processing. She had always known that her job was important, but this felt like a line she couldn't cross. Pretending to be someone's girlfriend? That wasn't something she had ever signed up for, especially not with her boss. The thought of it made her uncomfortable, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no real choice. The future of the hotel, her career, and everything she had worked for was at stake. The room seemed to grow smaller as Sophie weighed the options. What was more important, her integrity or her career? And was there really any difference between the two? She had already crossed so many boundaries just by being in his room that night, and now this. Was this just another line she would have to cross? I don't know, Sophie finally said, her voice quiet. She wasn't sure what else to say, but the reality of the situation was setting in. She was being asked to lie, to pretend to be something she wasn't, to pretend to feel something that wasn't there. It wasn't just the act of pretending to be Alex's girlfriend that bothered her. It was the idea that she would be complicit in something that felt so far outside of her control. Alex watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. I understand if you're uncomfortable with it, he said. But it's not just about me. This is about you too. This deal will change everything. You want your position here to mean something, right? This could be your chance to prove that you're more than just an assistant. You're a key player in this. Sophie felt her chest tighten. She hadn't expected Alex to turn her own ambitions against her like this. It made sense in a way. The deal was huge, and her role in it was important. But was this really the way she wanted to prove herself? By playing a part in a charade? Could she live with herself if she did? For a long moment, Sophie didn't say anything. She just sat there, lost in thought. Alex didn't push her, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. There was no doubt in his eyes. He knew she would eventually agree. It was just a matter of when. I can't do this alone, Sophie, he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been. I need your help, and I trust you to make it work. Sophie closed her eyes, the words sinking in like stones in her chest. She couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This was her moment. She had to decide. This was her chance. But at what cost? I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She opened her eyes to meet his gaze, and in that moment, she realized something that shook her to the core. This wasn't just about business anymore. It had never been about business. It was about something much bigger, and it was about to change everything. Alex nodded, his expression softening slightly. Thank you, Sophie. I knew I could count on you. Sophie stood, suddenly feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't sure how she felt about being pulled into Alex's world so intimately, but she had made her choice. Now there was no turning back. As she walked out of the room, her heart was heavy with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had just agreed to something that would forever alter the course of her life, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days were a constant whirl of business meetings, press conferences, and social appearances. Sophie had agreed to Alex's plan, albeit reluctantly, and now she was swept up in the roles they had to play for the sake of the deal. She found herself attending parties and dinners, always by Alex's side, smiling and engaging with the investors and guests as if she was the woman in his life. At first it felt like a game, one that Sophie had no intention of taking seriously. It was supposed to be nothing more than a means to an end, a temporary mask she would wear to secure the future she had worked so hard for. But as the days passed, she began to realize that she wasn't as immune to the act as she had thought. She had convinced herself that there was no way she could develop real feelings for Alex. After all, their interactions were nothing more than strategic, carefully orchestrated moments. Sophie knew the rules. Stay close, laugh at the right moments, look interested, but keep everything else at arm's length. But the more she spent time with him, the harder it became to ignore the pull between them. At the company's gala event, Alex was once again in his element. He moved through the crowd with ease, effortlessly commanding attention, his sharp features and magnetic presence drawing people in. Sophie, standing at his side, found herself watching him, her gaze lingering, for longer than it should. He was everything she wasn't. Unshakable, confident, in control. She had always admired him from afar, but tonight something was different. The way he smiled at her, the way his hand casually rested on her back as they walked together felt more intimate than it had ever been before. He was treating her as though they were already a couple, and in that moment, Sophie wondered how much of it was real and how much was just for show. It was a subtle shift, just a slight change in the way Alex held himself around her. When their eyes met across the room, there was something more there than just the business partnership they had built. Sophie couldn't quite place it, but she could feel it, and it terrified her. That night, after the event had ended, Alex asked her to join him for a late drink. Sophie hesitated for a moment before agreeing, knowing that her duties weren't over yet. They sat at the hotel bar, a quiet corner away from the other guests. Alex, unusually relaxed, leaned back in his chair, his usual stern demeanor replaced by something more approachable. He was wearing a soft smile, the kind he never let people see in public. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his voice low, his gaze never leaving hers. Sophie's heart skipped a beat at the unexpected compliment. She had grown accustomed to Alex's calculated words, his business-focused language, but this felt different. The warmth in his voice, the way his eyes lingered on her, it made her chest tighten. She looked away, trying to regain control of her thoughts. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. She couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze, afraid that if she did, he would see how much he had affected her. Alex leaned forward slightly, his eyes finally meeting hers. The atmosphere between them shifted again, more palpable this time, filled with an undeniable tension. Sophie could feel the pull between them, and for the first time she wasn't sure if it was just the act or something real, something deeper. "You know," Alex continued, his voice soft but tinged with something that made Sophie's pulse quicken, "we've been playing this role for a while now, but it doesn't have to be just an act, you know." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always known this was temporary. She had convinced herself it was just a business arrangement, that they were just pretending to be a couple for the sake of the deal. But hearing Alex say it like that, it was as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid to hear the answer. Alex's lips curved into a small smile, but there was something else behind it, a vulnerability that Sophie had never seen in him before. "I mean, we don't have to pretend anymore. We've already crossed that line, haven't we?" Sophie felt a wave of heat rush to her face, her heart racing as she tried to process what he was saying. Was he suggesting that this wasn't just a game for him, that he wanted more than a fake relationship? She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond to him. She didn't know if she could or if she even wanted to. The space between them seemed to close in, and for a moment Sophie wondered if Alex could hear the frantic beat of her heart. His gaze never left hers, and she could feel the intensity building between them. She had always told herself that she wasn't like this, that she wouldn't let herself be swept up in someone else's game. But now, sitting here with him, so close, so undeniably present, Sophie realized she wasn't as strong as she thought. She opened her mouth to speak, but Alex reached out, his fingers brushing against hers lightly. The contact was brief, but it sent a shock of electricity through her body. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. There was no turning back now. She could feel the heat in his touch, the weight of his gaze, and suddenly all the walls she had built between them felt fragile, like they could crumble at any moment. "I don't want to play games anymore, Sophie," Alex said, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "I think you know that too." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she had worked for, the man who had always been so cold, so distant, was telling her he wanted more. He wanted something real. She wasn't sure if she could trust her own emotions anymore. All she had known was the role she had been playing, but this was different. This was something that could change everything. Before she could respond, Alex stood up, his hand still lightly brushing hers. He didn't wait for her to speak. He didn't need to. Sophie's silence said everything he needed to hear. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Sophie tried to focus on the conversation around her, but all she could think about was Alex's words, the way he had looked at her. The tension between them was palpable, and it seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. When the event ended, Sophie found herself walking beside Alex down the hotel's quiet hallway, the weight of his presence pressing in on her. Her mind was a whirlwind, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and desire. She had never felt this way before. so completely lost in someone else. She had always been so careful, so guarded, but with Alex nothing seemed to make sense anymore. They reached her room and Alex turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither of them spoke. Sophie could feel the anticipation in the air, the space between them charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Alex stepped closer to her. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as he reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. The touch was soft, tender, and it made her heart race. She looked up at him, her lips parted, and in that moment she knew this wasn't just a game anymore. She wasn't pretending. Neither of them were. "I think I've waited long enough," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Sophie could react, his lips brushed against hers, a gentle kiss that was filled with so much emotion that it left her breathless. It wasn't a kiss of desire, though it carried that too. It was a kiss that spoke of something more, a connection, a truth that neither of them had been ready to face until now. The moment felt infinite, and Sophie knew without a doubt that everything had changed. When the kiss ended, Alex pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. "We can't go back now," he said quietly. Sophie nodded, her chest tight as she realized that he was right. There was no going back. The walls between them had come down, and what had started as an act had turned into something far more real, something neither of them could control anymore. As Alex turned to leave, Sophie stood in the doorway, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The fake relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. And Sophie wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Sophie had always thought she was in control of her emotions. She had always been the rational one, the level-headed assistant who kept everything together while the world around her seemed to whirl in chaos. She prided herself on the fact that nothing, not even Alex Sterling, the enigmatic billionaire who had captured her attention for months, could make her lose her composure. But now, as she spent more time with him, now that the lines between what was real and what was just part of the game they were playing had started to blur, Sophie found herself losing grip on everything she had once relied on. It had started innocently enough. Their interactions, although frequent, were still professional, at least on the surface. They had a job to do, and Sophie was determined to be the best at what she did. But over the last few weeks, something had changed. Something had shifted between her and Alex. The subtle touches that had once felt like innocent gestures now sent electricity through her veins. The glances that once held nothing but politeness had grown laden with unspoken meaning. And now every time Alex smiled at her, every time his gaze lingered on her just a second too long, Sophie felt something stir inside her. A feeling she couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried. She couldn't remember exactly when it had started. At first, it had been easy to brush off the chemistry between them. After all, this was all part of the act. She was pretending to be Alex's girlfriend for the sake of the deal, and he was playing along just as she was. They had both agreed that once the deal was done, they would go their separate ways. No harm, no foul. But now it felt like something else entirely. Every smile, every shared moment between them felt more and more real. Sophie found herself thinking about Alex even when she wasn't with him, wondering what he was doing, how he was feeling, whether he was as affected by their charade as she was. It wasn't just a game anymore, and that terrified her. One evening, after a long day of meetings and conference calls, Alex invited Sophie to join him for a late-night drink at the hotel bar. It wasn't unusual for them to spend time together, after hours. The investors were always keen on having them as a couple at social events, and they often used these moments to build rapport. But tonight felt different. Sophie couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way Alex had looked at her earlier that evening, or maybe it was the way his fingers had brushed against hers as they walked into the meeting room. Whatever it was, Sophie felt a tightness in her chest as she walked into the bar, the cool air surrounding her doing little to calm the heat that was building inside. Alex was already seated, his back to her as he glanced out over the city skyline. There was something oddly vulnerable about the way he held himself tonight, as though the usual shield of confidence had slipped just a little. When he turned to see her approach, he smiled. Warm, easy, like there was nothing in the world he wanted more than to be here with her. "Join me?" he asked, gesturing to the seat next to him. Sophie sat down, her heart fluttering at the closeness between them. She wasn't sure if it was the wine from earlier or the steady thrum of anxiety in her chest, but she felt more exposed than she ever had before. "Are you doing all right?" Alex asked, his voice soft. It wasn't a question she had expected from him. He was the one always in control, the one who made everyone else feel like they were playing catch-up. But tonight, it seemed like he wanted to know more about her, really know her. "I'm fine," Sophie replied, her voice betraying her. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "Just a little tired." Alex's eyes softened as he watched her, a look in his eyes that made her stomach flip. "You don't look tired, you look—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Beautiful." The compliment took Sophie by surprise, leaving her momentarily speechless. She wasn't used to Alex's words carrying so much weight. It wasn't just the fact that he had called her beautiful. It was the way he had said it, the way his gaze had never wavered. He wasn't just paying lip service. He meant it. And that terrified her more than anything. Sophie let out a shaky breath, trying to keep her composure. "Thank you," she managed, looking down at her drink, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Alex reached for his drink, but his hand lingered in mid-air as he studied her. Sophie felt his gaze like a physical touch, the weight of it pressing into her skin. She couldn't escape it, couldn't ignore it. It was as if they were standing at the edge of something real, and neither of them knew if they were ready to fall. "You've been different lately," Alex said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You've seemed distant. Is something wrong?" Sophie froze. The question caught her off guard. She had been trying so hard to keep her emotions in check, to distance herself from whatever this was between them, but Alex was seeing through the facade. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending, and the weight of that truth hung between them like an unspoken challenge. "I'm fine," she said again, this time with more conviction. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Alex didn't seem convinced. He placed his glass down on the table and leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Sophie, I don't think you are. And I don't think you're telling me everything." Sophie's heart began to race as she realized just how close they were now. His presence filled the space between them, and she felt that familiar pull again, the one that had been growing stronger by the day. She couldn't deny it anymore. It wasn't just the act. It was more than that. It was the way Alex made her feel alive, the way he made her heart race without even trying. It was the way he saw her, truly saw her, as something more than just his assistant. And that scared her, but it also thrilled her. "I'm just not sure what to do anymore," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in her words caught her off guard, but once it was out there, it felt like a weight had been lifted. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding back until now. Alex's expression softened, and for the first time Sophie saw a flicker of something more in his eyes. He wasn't just the calculating businessman she had always known. He was a man, just like her, struggling with the same emotions. "Maybe we don't need to figure it all out right now," Alex said, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe we just need to be honest with each other about what this really is." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had always told herself that this was just a game, a way to get the deal done and move on with their lives. But the Aizima way Alex was looking at her, the way he was speaking to her, it didn't feel like a game anymore. It felt real, too real. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Sophie admitted, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know if I can keep pretending when I'm feeling something more." Alex's hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her body, as if everything she had been suppressing was finally bubbling to the surface. She looked up at him, her eyes locking with his, and in that moment Sophie knew this wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about the investors, the deal, or the charade they had been playing. This was about something real, something they couldn't ignore. "I don't want to pretend anymore either," Alex said quietly. "But we have to be careful. We can't let this ruin everything we've worked for." Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She didn't want to ruin everything. She didn't want to risk it all. But how could she walk away from something that felt so right? How could she deny the connection between them, something that had grown over time, something that couldn't be undone? As the night wore on, Sophie found herself more conflicted than ever before. The line between what was real and what was a game had blurred beyond recognition. And she knew that whatever decision she made next, it would change everything. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of that change. She was ready to face it, whatever it was. But she also knew that Alex wasn't just playing anymore. Neither of them were. The stakes had grown higher than either of them had anticipated, and Sophie didn't know if she was ready for the consequences. The days that followed the unspoken admission between Sophie and Alex were an agonizing blur. The air around them had shifted, palpable and thick with unspoken words. Sophie found herself caught between the need to remain professional and the undeniable pull she felt toward Alex. She had always prided herself on being strong, level-headed, and in control. But now, those traits felt foreign. Every time Alex's eyes met hers, every time he brushed against her, she felt a rush of emotions that made it harder and harder to distinguish what was real from what was just part of the facade they had both created. Despite the constant proximity, Sophie had never felt more distant from herself. The walls she had spent years building around her emotions were slowly crumbling, and she was left standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to leap or step back. She had always kept a tight grip on her feelings, knowing that the life she had carved out for herself, her career, her future, depended on her ability to stay focused and keep everything in its place. But Alex had shaken that foundation, and now she was left grappling with the disorienting feeling of wanting something she wasn't sure she could have. It was one evening, just after another lavish dinner with the investors, when Sophie found herself standing at the edge of the hotel's terrace, staring out into the vast expanse of the city. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to cool the heat that had built up in her chest. Sophie's mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in the chaos of what had been happening over the past few weeks. It had started as a lie, a simple pretense for the sake of business, but now it felt like something far more dangerous, something real. And yet, there was a voice inside her head telling her to stop, to pull back before she lost herself completely. This was all supposed to be temporary. Once the deal was done, once the investors were satisfied, Sophie and Alex would go their separate ways. There was no room for anything more. There couldn't be. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the moment she had agreed to play along with the fake relationship, she had crossed a line. She had let herself believe that there was something more between them, something that wasn't just part of the act. A soft step behind her brought her out of her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. It was Alex. She could feel his presence without even seeing him, the weight of it pressing down on her. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she wasn't prepared for it. How could she be? How could she be prepared to confront the growing feelings she had for him, the undeniable attraction that had taken root inside her? She had tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just a product of the situation, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Sophie. Alex's voice broke through the silence, his tone low and steady, but there was something in it that made her stomach tighten. We need to talk. Her heart skipped a beat and she swallowed hard. She had known this moment would come. She had known they couldn't keep dancing around their feelings forever. But that didn't make it any easier. Sophie turned to face him, her pulse quickening. Alex stood a few steps away, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in that familiar way that always made her feel like he was in control of everything. But tonight, there was something different in his expression, something that hinted at vulnerability, something she had never seen before. About what? Sophie asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. It trembled just slightly and she hated herself for it. Alex took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. About us, he said simply. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it all the more real. They had both played their parts pretending to be something they weren't. But now it seemed like the lines had become so blurred that neither of them could pretend anymore. She didn't know if she was ready to confront the truth. She wasn't sure if she was ready to admit what was happening between them. But deep down, she knew it was inevitable. The truth had been simmering under the surface for too long, and now it was rising, too powerful to ignore. I think we both know that this isn't just business anymore, Alex said, his voice quieter now, the edge of authority gone. It was replaced by something else, something softer, more vulnerable. We've crossed the line, Sophie, and I can't pretend it didn't happen. Sophie's heart raced, and for a moment she couldn't find her words. She had promised herself that she would stay detached, that she would never let her emotions get in the way of her career. But now, looking at Alex, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, she realized that she wasn't in control anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be. Alex, Sophie's voice faltered. This was never supposed to happen. We agreed it was just for the deal, just for the investors. Nothing more. Alex shook his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. It started that way, I know, he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. But somewhere along the line it stopped being just for the deal. I can't speak for you, Sophie, but I've started to care about what happens next. I've started to care about us. Sophie's chest tightened at his words, the weight of them pressing down on her like a physical force. This wasn't just about business anymore, and that scared her more than anything. She had allowed herself to believe that there could be something real between them, something that went beyond the pretense they had been living. But the truth was that she had never been this vulnerable before. She had never allowed herself to feel this way about someone she worked with, someone who was, in so many ways, still her boss. I didn't expect this, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't expect to feel anything for you. I told myself I could do this, that it was just part of the job, but now I'm not so sure. Alex stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. Sophie's breath caught in her throat at the contact, the warmth of his touch sending a wave of emotion flooding through her. She had fought so hard to keep herself detached, to maintain control, but now, standing so close to him, she couldn't hold back any longer. I never wanted to complicate things, Sophie, Alex said, his voice thick with emotion. But I can't pretend anymore. I care about you. I need to know if you feel the same. Sophie closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say. How could she? The truth was that she did feel something for him, something deep, something that had been growing since the moment they had started this charade. But could she really allow herself to feel it? Could she take the risk of opening up to someone who, at the end of the day, was still her boss? Was still someone whose world she didn't belong to? When Sophie opened her eyes, Alex was still standing before her, his gaze searching hers, waiting for her answer. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. And in that moment, she realized that it wasn't just about them anymore. It wasn't just about pretending, about playing a role for the sake of the deal. It was about choosing whether or not she was willing to give up everything she had worked for in order to follow her heart. I don't know what to do, Sophie admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can do this, if I can trust myself to follow this, whatever this is between us. Alex didn't pull away, his hands still gently holding her face. His thumb stroked her skin, a silent reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. You don't have to decide everything right now, he said softly. But you have to know that I'm not asking you to choose between your career and me. I'm asking you to choose yourself. I'm asking you to be real with me, with us. Sophie closed her eyes again, taking a deep breath as she let his words wash over her. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about what she wanted, what she was willing to risk for the chance at something real, something beyond the facade they had built. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time she wasn't afraid to take that step. I'm scared, she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice raw and unguarded. I know, Alex replied, his voice filled with understanding. But I'm here, and I'll be here no matter what you decide. And in that moment, Sophie realized that this wasn't just about the business deal, about the pretense, or about the investors. It was about the truth that she had tried so hard to ignore, but that now, in the quiet of the night, was impossible to deny. I'm willing to try, Sophie said, her voice steady now. I'm willing to see where this can go. Alex's eyes softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He stepped closer, his hand gently brushing her hair from her face as he leaned in to kiss her. It was a kiss that was full of promise, full of uncertainty, but also full of the undeniable truth that they were no longer playing a game. This was real, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sophie had never felt more conflicted in her life. In the days that followed the decision to embrace what had started as a mere pretense, everything seemed to change in an instant. She had known deep down that her feelings for Alex were growing, but she had pushed them aside, convinced that this charade was temporary, that once the deal was sealed, they would go back to their respective worlds, unaffected by the roles they had played. But nothing in the weeks that followed had gone as planned. The lines between reality and the act they had created had blurred so seamlessly that Sophie found it hard to tell when one ended and the other began. Alex's touch, his words, the way he looked at her, they all held layers of meaning she hadn't been prepared for. It was one thing to pretend for the sake of business, but it was another thing entirely to find herself deeply entangled in something real. She stood in front of the mirror one morning, staring at her reflection as if looking for answers. The person staring back at her seemed so different from the woman who had first entered this world. Sophie had always been focused on her career, her dreams of proving herself in a high-stakes environment where she could shine. But now she wasn't sure if the world she had built for herself was the one she truly wanted anymore. The deal had been finalized. The investors were satisfied. The partnership was secure. And yet, in the midst of her success, Sophie felt a hollow emptiness she couldn't ignore. She had agreed to this. She had agreed to pretend, to step into a role she had never thought possible. But now, with the deal behind her and the path ahead uncertain, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. What was the cost of her decision? What had she truly signed up for when she allowed herself to fall into Alex's arms? The sound of a knock at the door startled Sophie from her thoughts. She quickly composed herself, wiping away any trace of emotion that threatened to reveal the storm inside. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. This was the moment everything would be decided. When she opened the door, she found Alex standing there, his usual air of calm confidence replaced by something else. There was no business mask, no cold exterior. Instead, he looked vulnerable, his eyes filled with something Sophie couldn't place. He was holding a small box in his hands, and as he stepped closer, Sophie noticed his usual arrogance was replaced by a subtle uncertainty. "Sophie," he began, his voice more tentative than she had ever heard it. "We need to talk." Sophie felt a pang in her chest. She had known this conversation was coming, but the weight of it was heavier than she had anticipated. "What about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Alex held the box out to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "This," he said simply. Sophie looked down at the box in his hands, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel her pulse quicken as she reached out to take it. Inside, she found a small key. It wasn't just any key. It was the key to a new chapter, to a future that she had no idea how to navigate. She met Alex's gaze, her confusion evident. "You don't have to decide right now," Alex said, his voice quiet but filled with the sincerity she couldn't ignore. "But I want you to know something. This isn't just about the business, it's about us. What we've built, what we could have." Sophie's heart ached as she looked at the key. The weight of the decision before her seemed unbearable. She had spent so long building a life that revolved around her career, around her ambitions. But now, the future she had worked so hard for seemed to pale in comparison to what she had with Alex. Was she willing to take that risk? Was she ready to throw away everything she had built for the chance at something real? "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Sophie admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I've been pretending. I've been playing along because I thought it was just part of the deal, part of what I had to do. But I can't pretend anymore, Alex. I can't pretend that this is just business when I feel something more." Alex stepped closer, his eyes filled with both understanding and hope. He took a step toward her, closing the gap that had always existed between them. "I don't want you to pretend. I want you to be honest. With yourself. With me. I'm asking you to choose, Sophie. Choose us. Choose something real." Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. The vulnerability in his words, in the way he was looking at her, broke through the walls she had so carefully built. She had spent so long pretending that she had forgotten what it was like to just feel. And now, standing here with Alex, she realized that she couldn't walk away from this. She couldn't walk away from him. "I don't know what this will mean for us, for my future," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can just give up everything I've worked for. But I can't deny how I feel about you, Alex. And I can't pretend that this isn't something real, something worth fighting for." Alex reached out, gently cupping her face with his hands. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to lean into it. She closed her eyes, savoring the closeness, the connection they shared. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the same vulnerability reflected in Alex's gaze. He wasn't asking her for anything. He wasn't pressuring her. He was simply offering her the chance to choose herself, to choose them, to choose a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "I don't have all the answers," Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to find out." Alex's lips curved into a smile, and for the first time Sophie saw the man beneath the powerful CEO, the man who had allowed himself to care, to risk, it all for something real. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, a silent promise that everything would be different now. Sophie felt a sense of calm settle over her. The uncertainty of the future no longer seemed so frightening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer alone. She had chosen to step into the unknown, to trust in the feelings that had grown between her and Alex. And in doing so, she had chosen a future filled with possibility. One that was real. One that was hers. As Alex took her hand, guiding her toward the door, Sophie realized that sometimes the most uncertain paths led to the most beautiful destinations. They didn't need to know everything right now. They didn't need to have all the answers. All they needed was to take that first step together. And as they walked into the future hand in hand, Sophie knew that whatever came next, it would be worth it. Because this time they weren't just pretending. This was real. And it was the beginning of something new, something worth holding on to. In the journey of Sophie and Alex, we learned that sometimes the lines between professional, ambition, and personal emotions blur in unexpected ways. This story reminds us that life is rarely about playing it safe or sticking to the path we've always known. It's about taking risks, embracing vulnerability, and being brave enough to choose what's real, even when it means stepping into the unknown. Sophie's courage to face her feelings and choose a future she truly desires is a lesson for us all. Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most meaningful rewards. Don't be afraid to let your heart lead you, even when the future seems uncertain. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming, dramatic tales that will leave you wanting more. Your support encourages us to keep creating more captivating content. Stay tuned for our next adventure.